If you have your Bibles this morning, if you'll grab them, go to Jonah chapter 1. As kids are filing out to go to Kids Club. If you were not with us last week, let me catch you up on what you missed. We didn't get very far, but we actually covered a lot at the same time. We started a new series on the story of Jonah, and we got 3 verses in because there's just so much to deal with. And so let me remind us where we've been so that we can springboard forward into where we're going in our passage this morning. Last week, at the very opening of this story, we see Jonah, a prophet of God, receiving both a message and a mission from God. And do you remember what it was? God told Jonah to get up and to go. He wants you to go to the Assyrian kingdom, the Assyrian empire, to a city called Nineveh. And what did God want him to do there? Preach judgment. He wanted Jonah to go to the Assyrians, to the Ninevites in particular, and tell them that God is aware of how they've been living and he's not okay with it and that judgment is coming. But here's the thing. As clear and direct as that message was from God, and as faithful and successful as Jonah had been as a prophet for years before, this time, with this message and this mission, he had a problem. And the problem wasn't how wicked Nineveh was. It wasn't how fearsome and brutal and awful the Assyrian Empire was. It wasn't a matter of distance, how far he had to go. The problem wasn't even how much he hated the Assyrians and everything that they stood for. What was his problem? His problem was God had given him a job to do, and he just didn't want to do it. See, as much as he may have delighted in the fact that the Assyrians were going to get what was coming to them, as much as he would have been happy that the Assyrians were going to receive God's judgment, Jonah also knew the heart of God well enough to know that mercy is always an option. So what did he do? He ran. Literally, he took off in the direction that God had told him to go, in the hopes that maybe, just maybe, if he couldn't stop God, if he couldn't even slow God down from what he was going to do, maybe he could remove himself from the equation and not have to take part in it. But what he failed to realize is that just because God lets you run doesn't mean that God has let you go. So one way or another, Jonah was going to have to come to terms with just how big and deep and wide God's mercy is. Not just God's righteousness and his holiness and his power and his judgment, all that's still in play. But what Jonah needed to learn was how big and deep and wide God's mercy is. And that's what we're going to see continue to play out in our passage this morning. There's going to be a lot going on in this next part of the story. But what we're going to focus on this morning is how God, in his power, in his glory, in his goodness, in his wisdom, can use anything and everything that he wants to bring about his purposes. And he can use anything and everything he wants as he pursues those that he loves. And so this morning, we're going to see God use a storm, and we're going to see the different ways that he uses it for the good of the people and the glory of his name. So let's look together. Jonah chapter 1, we're going to start with verses 1 through 6, and you can follow along as I read out loud for us. It says, "Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah the son of Amittai, saying this, 'Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me.' But Jonah instead rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. So he went down to Joppa, and he found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid the fare, and he went on board to go with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord." Verse 4. "But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and there was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship threatened to break up. Then the mariners, the sailors, they were afraid, and each cried out to their own God, and they hurled the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. But Jonah, he had gone down to the inner part of the ship and had laid down and was fast asleep. So the captain came and said to him, 'What do you mean, you sleeper? Arise, call out to your God. Perhaps that God will give a thought to us that we may not perish.'" So we're going to stop here for right now. Here's the first thing I want to point out here, and you can write it down if you're taking notes this morning, and it's this: God can use storms to rouse. God can use storms to rouse. Years ago, I was doing some mission work, some mission training overseas, and I woke up one morning, and I don't even remember what it was, but I was just in a bad mood. I don't know if that ever happens to you. You're just kind of like in a funk, and if you start the day in a funk, usually how's that day play out? Not great, because things add to it and build to it, and you become like a funk magnet, or you're just drawing, I don't know, negative attention. I don't know what it was, but I remember I was walking down the sidewalk. I had a teammate, my roommate was with me, and we were going to wherever we had, whatever task we had for the day was somewhere else in the city, and we were walking there, and I was grumbling and mumbling to myself, and I was just racing it in my mind. And if you've ever been like that in a bad mood, and you're thinking about it and thinking about it and thinking about it, it just kind of compounds on itself. And then, like, physically, I was carrying the weight, whatever was bothering me, and I was looking down, and I ran into a tree branch. Like, perfectly designed for my height on that sidewalk right in the forehead. So guess what I did, being the mature young man that I was? I got even more mad. Like, oh, who would put a tree here on this sidewalk? And now I'm going to add them to my list of things I'm mad about. And I keep going and I keep grumbling and I keep walking and I'm still mad. And guess what happens? I run into another tree branch at the exact same height, the exact same spot on my head. So guess what I did? I got even more mad, and now I think the world is out to get me. I think God must be mad, the universe, whatever it is. I just add it to my list of grievances, and I'm even more frustrated. I'm not paying attention to anyone or anything else at this point, just my own frustration with this day, and I keep walking, and guess what happened? Not a tree this time. I ran into an umbrella, one of those giant umbrellas at like an outdoor cafe kind of thing, in the same spot on my head. And finally, at this point, I stop, literally, physically look up, notice the world around me, look behind me on the sidewalk I had walked on and all these trees I hadn't noticed, and I just died laughing. Because it took 2 trees and a giant umbrella for God to finally get my attention that I needed to just chill out and let it go. Whatever was bothering me wasn't that big of a deal. He had a day ahead ready for me if I would receive it and let it go. That's the sort of thing that we see at play here with Jonah, but on a far more serious level. See, as a clear sign of his disapproval of Jonah's rebellion, what did verse 4 say that God did? That he stirred up, he hurled, he threw a storm onto the sea. Because here's the thing, if Jonah was going to turn a deaf ear to God's voice, God was going to find another way to reach out to him, another way to communicate to him. And if he wasn't going to listen to the voice of God, maybe he would hear the echoes of God's power as it's on display in nature. But what do we see in the story? How deaf, how numb had Jonah become to the voice and the leading of the Lord? He didn't listen to the voice of the Lord, and even though this storm was violent enough and scary enough that these veteran sailors were scared for their lives, where was Jonah? Snoozing, asleep down in the cabin? But even then, God's not done with him and doesn't give up on him, and God sends the sea captain to wake Jonah up with some really choice words to say. He says, wake up and do what? Call out to your God. Maybe your God will listen. Maybe your God knows something. Maybe your God is up to something. Maybe your God can do something. Now, on the one hand, we can read that as just pure coincidence, that this is a pagan sailor, and that's what pagan sailors did. They had their gods. Maybe this guy had a god, and we're all calling out to our gods, and it's no big deal. Or we can realize that this story really is about God. And if the story really is ultimately about God, then try as we might, like Jonah, we can't really escape him. So what God is doing here is he's using this storm at sea to rouse Jonah, not just literally from his sleep, but in a deeper spiritual sense, to wake him up, to get his attention, to let him know that God knew what was going on, to let him know that he still needed to deal with God. And if we're honest, the Lord does the same thing in our own lives, doesn't he? It may not be a literal storm at sea, but God so often uses the storms of life to speak to us, to wake us up, to get our attention. And like Jonah, it's not because God is so mean. It's not because God hates us. It's not like God is against us or trying to harm us. It's more likely that we've grown deaf to his speaking. It's more likely that we've hardened our hearts and we've been looking in another direction. And so if we're not going to listen to him this way, God is going to choose to work a different way. As C.S. Lewis once wrote in his book, The Problem of Pain, God whispers to us in our pleasures. He speaks in our conscience, but he shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. So God can use the storms of life, whether they're literal or figurative, to speak to us, to rouse us, to wake us up. But it keeps going. There's more to it. God can also use the storms of life to show us the truth about ourselves and our situation. That's the second point. If you're taking notes, go ahead and write this down. God can also use storms to reveal, to rouse us, but also to reveal. So let's continue the story, verses 7 through 10. So the sailors come together and they say to one another, "Come, let us cast lots that we might know on whose account this evil has come upon us." So they cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. So they said to him, "Tell us on whose account this evil has come upon us. What's your occupation? Where do you come from? What's your country? What people are you?" And Jonah said to them, "I'm a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." Then the men, it says, were exceedingly afraid, and they said to him, "What is this that you've done?" For the men knew that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord because he had told them. Think about this in your own life. How easy is it for us to look good and feel good and have it all together when we actually have it all together? Right? When things are going well, when they're going our way, when they're playing out the way that we had planned, that we were ready for, that we were prepared for. In moments like that, seasons of life like that, it's real easy to feel good and feel like you've got it all together. But what happens when the unexpected happens? What happens when tragedy strikes or adversity shows up? Oftentimes, it's not until we face difficulty and hardship that we finally discover the truth about who we are or the truth about what it is that we're really working with in life. There's just something about fear that does this, or something about pain and suffering that's especially powerful. That sort of storm can stir things up, can it? That sort of storm in life can bring things to the surface. It can reveal or expose things that we didn't know were there inside us or maybe inside a relationship. These types of storms in life can also stir up things that we knew were there but we were running from, or we intentionally were not paying attention to, or maybe even trying to hide in the first place. That's what we see here in our story. So this storm hits, and it is bigger and badder than anyone can handle. And when these sailors, these veteran sailors, realize all their previous experience and all their good ideas and all their best efforts are useless, what do? What happens? It says they get real religious real quick, right? And that's not an accident, is it? God has used the storm to reveal to them what it is they believe, and more importantly, who or what it is they put their trust in. But there's more to that than even that. This is where we see the hand of God at work. So God has used the storm to reveal what everyone believed, to expose who it is or what it is that they really trust in, who they're going to call when they're in trouble, who they're going to put their life, whose hands when it matters most. But in doing so, do you see what this gave Jonah? It gave Jonah the perfect opportunity to bear witness, right? So these sailors are calling out and reaching out to any god they could ever imagine or ever come up with or maybe make up in this moment. They're doing everything they can to survive. They don't know what's going on. And God has given Jonah this opportunity on a silver platter to tell them what's going on, to point them to the one true God of the universe, that they might know him. God has orchestrated this so the sailors literally came to Jonah to ask him about God. But how does Jonah handle it? Look again at verses 8 and 9. Of all the rapid-fire questions that they ask him, did you notice which one he didn't answer? He tells them where he's from. He even tells them what God he believes in and belongs to, but he left out a key detail, his occupation. He doesn't tell them that he's a prophet. So what does that mean? And why does it matter? Well, it means that even here, in this life or death moment, even here when the storm has literally stripped everything else away and everyone is in the perfect position to turn to God and trust him and worship him, even here in this moment, Jonah is still on the run. So the storm has revealed something else. It's revealed his character. The storm has revealed just how stubborn he is, how hard-hearted he's become. And let's be honest, he doesn't deny the truth of who God is, right? He tells the sailors, I believe in God, and he's the king of the universe. He's the one who created the dry land and the seas. He's the one that's the Lord over these raging seas. But here's the problem. That's not enough to tell them that, yeah, it's my God that's doing this, because then he does nothing good with that declaration, right? He still leaves the men in their fear and their panic and in their despair. So once again, in his stubborn rebellion against God, we see Jonah refuse to be used by God to bless someone else. Refuse to be used by God for the good of someone else. But once again, we'll see God work. We'll see that even though Jonah is hardened in his rebellion and in his disobedience and is still choosing to run, we'll see that God and his infinite goodness and mercy won't leave it at that. And that leads us to the third point, the best point of all. God can use storms to redeem. God can use storms to redeem. Let's look now at verses 11 through 16. Then the sailors said to Jonah, "What shall we do to you, that the sea might quiet down for us?" For the sea grew more and more tempestuous. So he said to them, "Look, pick me up, hurl me into the sea, and then the sea will quiet down for you, for I know it's because of me that this great tempest has come upon you." But nevertheless, the men still tried to row hard to get back to dry land, but they couldn't, for the sea was growing more and more tempestuous against them. Therefore they called out to the Lord, "O Lord, let us not perish for this man's life, and lay not on us innocent blood, for you, O Lord, have done as it pleased you." So they picked up Jonah, and they hurled him to the sea, and the sea ceased from its raging. Then the men feared the Lord exceedingly. They offered a sacrifice to the Lord, and they made vows. Let's talk a moment about redemption. This is another one of those good spiritual buzzwords that we recognize in church. We think it's a good thing, but we may not necessarily know what it means or what it refers to. So, what do we mean when we say that something can be redemptive? Or what do we mean when we say that God can redeem a person or a situation? Well, in the most practical, basic sense, to redeem something means to purchase it or to buy it back or to set it free. So, in other words, something is kept a part of you, apart from you in some way for some reason, and a price must be paid for you to get it or to get it back, or a ransom must be offered so that you can then set it free. And if we think about it, there's a direction to redemption. There's a change, there's a transfer that takes place. We are redeemed from something dark and terrible and to something good and life giving and free. So when we say a situation is redemptive, what we're talking about is how God can take something in our life that is otherwise bad and dark and painful and destructive, but then He can use it somehow, some way for our own life and good. And that's exactly how God used the storm in the lives of those sailors, isn't it? They were frantic and they were terrified and they were staring down certain death. They were at the mercy of this raging sea and the God who controlled it. But by the end, what happened? These sailors who entered the story as salty, hardened seafarers leave the story as humbled, believing converts. These men who started by crying out to whatever gods they could possibly think of ended up crying out to the one true God in worship. These men who were lost at sea physically and spiritually, who were racing towards a dead end, in the end, find solid ground in both cases. God used the storm to wake them up, not just to His existence, to who He is, not just to His power and His authority, even over the wild seas. God used the storm to wake them up to His great mercy. And how did they respond? These men who, when the day started, had no idea who God was, once they encountered Him for who He was and experienced His mercy, it says they responded in faith and worship, and the one thing that Jonah still will not do, so they made vows of obedience. We will serve this God. So what about Jonah? Because if we're being honest, the storm wasn't really that redemptive for him yet, was it? Look again at verse 12. Jonah knew exactly what was going on, and yet he still had a hard heart. He still didn't repent. He still didn't care. He still didn't cry out to God. He still didn't change his ways. Jonah's hard-hearted rebellion was so solid that it was going to take something even more to get through to him. I mean, think about it. Think about all the different ways that God had been speaking to him, all the different opportunities that God had given him to wake up and to turn around and to listen to God and to respond faithfully. I mean, first and foremost, God spoke to him literally, directly, and Jonah ignored it. And Jonah ran. And then in his running, in his rebellion, God continued to pursue him and speak to him in all these different ways that give him all these signs, the storm at sea and the sailors asking him questions, and then the sailors themselves coming to faith and worship your God, and Jonah still doesn't budge. So here's the thing. Since Jonah continued to harden his heart against God, he was going to have to learn the truth the hard way. By his own doing, Jonah was completely lost at sea, physically and spiritually. And he chose to stay there instead of turn to God. This is my paraphrase of what he says. Jonah admits, look, I'd rather just die. I'd rather just die. Look, just throw me in the water. Let me drown. But what Jonah didn't realize is that God wasn't going to let him drown in the stormy sea because he was going to drown in the sea of God's mercy. Even though Jonah was through with God, maybe you know where I'm going with this, God was not through with Jonah. So that leads me this morning to a concept I want to share with you that I've been wrestling with lately. And it's what I call the holy reversal. And it plays out in two ways. Here's the first one. Sometimes the best thing in your life is the worst thing for your soul. Sometimes the best thing in your life is the worst thing for your soul. Think about it. God spoke to Jonah. He gave him a message and a mission, but then he also gave him room to respond however he wanted. And Jonah did. He responded exactly how he wanted. He said, no, thank you, not interested. And he took off running the other direction. And did God smite him immediately? He didn't. God let him run. And Jonah ran, and he went down to Joppa, and God let him go to Joppa. And Jonah looked for a ship, and God let him find a ship. And Jonah got on the ship, and God let him get on the ship. Jonah set sail, and everything seemed to be smoothly going. His plan was working. He had gotten out of the eye of God and was racing the other direction, and it was successful until it wasn't. He seemed to get exactly what he wanted, but it didn't work out that way in the end. Another good example from Scripture earlier in history is that of King Saul and the people of Israel. Do you remember? At that point in time, the people had asked God for a king. It was worse than that, actually. They had rejected God as king over them and told God, we want a human king. Give us an earthly king to rule over us like all the other nations. We want to be like everyone else. And if you remember the story of Scripture, God says this isn't a good idea, that this isn't going to end well for you. No one's going to love you the way I love you. No one's going to provide for you the way I provide for you. Human kings have all these issues. God laid it out for them, and they didn't care. They said, no, we know what we want. We know what's good for us. Give us a king. And what did God do? He did. He gave them King Saul. And he even blessed them and blessed Saul at the beginning. So the people got exactly what they wanted. Saul himself got exactly what he wanted, and it went well for a while. It worked famously for a while. He was successful, and he looked the part, and he played the part until things started to fall apart. And what did God do? God didn't immediately swoop in and save the day. He didn't immediately swoop in and fix things for them. He let them sit in their disobedience, and he let them face the full weight and the reality, the consequences of their decision. He let them get what they wanted so they could see that it wasn't the best thing for them. Same thing is true in our own lives. It's entirely possible. It's more than likely probable that we can chase after all sorts of things in life that we think that we want and that we need, and we can actually get them. We can chase after all sorts of things that we think will make us happy or healthy or whole or make us popular or powerful or prominent. We can chase after so many things, work so hard to get them, and we can get them. And yet, in the end, those things won't just fail us. Those very same things can undo us and ruin us. Instead of being life-giving and fulfilling, we'll find that they've drained us and left us empty. And God can let us find that out the hard way if we insist. God will give us room to run. God will give us room to make those decisions and chase after those things. But we need to learn what Jonah had to learn, that just because God lets us run does not mean that he's okay with it. In Romans chapter 2, verse 4, the Apostle Paul talks about this sort of thing. He says, don't presume upon, don't take for granted the riches of God's kindness and his forbearance and his patience with you. Don't you know that the kindness of God, the patience of God is meant to lead you to what? Do you know? Repentance. God gives you room to run, not so that you can just have what you want and destroy yourself. He gives you room to run, to give you the space to recognize that's not what's best for you. So don't just keep running if you're running from God. Don't just keep running because it seems to be working and you're getting what you want. And don't just wait for things to fall apart. Don't wait for disaster to strike to stop and turn around. Right here today, for the sake of your own soul, turn to God. Stop your running, turn back to him. Sometimes the best thing in your life is the worst thing for your soul, but there's good news today because the reverse is also true. Sometimes the worst thing in your life is the best thing for your soul. Look now at verse 17. It says, and the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow up Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of that fish 3 days and 3 nights. Now, at this point in the story, Jonah doesn't know it yet. And if this is the first time that you've interacted with the story, you don't know it yet either. But this terrible event that happened is actually a good thing. Even though it looks like Jonah has finally met his match, that he's finally run out of room to rebel, that he's finally dealing with the consequences of his terrible disobedience, and everything's gone from bad to worse, this is actually a huge blessing. Because now that Jonah has reached a literal and figurative dead end, guess who he's finally going to turn to? And guess who's going to be right there waiting for him? The same is true in our own lives today. There are going to be terrible things that happen in life. Welcome to life, right? There are going to be terrible things, and sometimes it's our own fault. It's the consequences of our own decisions, our own actions. We've brought it upon ourselves, and it's awful. Or sometimes we live in a broken world with broken people, and it's someone else's fault, but we're still having to deal with it. Regardless, we can know that even if we're facing something terrible, we serve a God who can do something good with something bad. We serve a God who can do the impossible. We serve a God who can make a way when there seems to be no way. We serve a God who is at work even if we can't see it or understand it. We serve a God who knows what to do even if we don't know what to ask him for, who does things we don't even know to ask him for. Most importantly of all, we serve a God who can raise the dead. So let me close with this morning. A final question for all of us to wrestle with. How far is God willing to go to pursue those he loves? How far is God willing to go? What lengths is he willing to go to show us his love and mercy? To the ends of the earth? To the depths of the sea? Maybe, like Jonah's case, to the very brink of death itself? The answer is on the stained glass behind me in the baptistry. How far is God willing to go so that we might know his great love for us? Not just to death, but through death, to death and beyond, as we've seen through his Son, Jesus Christ, who took on our brokenness, who took on our storms, who took on all the consequences of the things that we've done and left it in the empty grave when he rose again. That's the type of God we're dealing with. So the call on our life this morning is, if we're running, stop. Stop. Doesn't matter what we're running to or what we think we're running from, we need to know that God is watching us and God is with us. And if we would just stop, not later, not eventually, not when things finally hit rock bottom, but right here, right now, if we'll stop and turn around, we don't even have to make our way back, because if we'll stop and turn around, we'll see that God is right there with us. This is the God that we're dealing with. So if you're running today, if you've been on the run, the call on your life is to throw yourself in the sea of God's mercy and watch what he can do with you. Let's pray.